If there's anything that fan fiction proves, it's that nothing's definitive. But I did write probably the first real mainstream piece about fan fiction that didn't make fun of it. I've been interested in fan fiction for a long time, for a lot of different reasons. The first time I came into contact personally with the fan fiction culture was at a Harry Potter convention in San Francisco in 2009. I went to a panel. I was there promoting my books, but I went to a panel which was a Snarry panel, and Snarry is Snape and Harry. It's a whole little micro subculture of people who are interested in stories about Snape and Harry having a romance. So I went to their panel because I thought that sounded interesting, and boy, was it interesting. It wasn't what I expected at all. First of all, the people were very unfreaky. They were unfreaky. They weren't in costume. They were just regular folks, mostly women. Mostly, I would say, sort of 30s. And they were so technical about it. You know, they had words for everything. Is this time travel? Is this alternate reality? Are we working within the canon? Outside the canon? Are we changing things? What are we changing? It was just this wonderfully mature subculture. And they took it all really seriously. I loved it. I loved how much they cared about this story. And I kind of wanted to know more about why they cared. Well, I also was becoming interested in a general way about changing ideas of intellectual property, which doesn't on the face of it sound very interesting. But something really weird, I think, is happening culturally right now. I think we're moving away from this kind of romantic idea. You're the genius, you're creating an original idea, and that's your work of art. And much more towards this kind of remixing idea, where stories are out there, and I'll tell it one way, you'll tell it another way, another person will combine it in several different ways, and that's a way of being creative too. We're not really making up stories, we just inherit them from other people, and we curate them and manipulate them, and then we send them on their way. I thought that was interesting, and fan fiction brings all that stuff together.
And you're a professional writer and write your own fantasy novels, so how does that play into what you do? I mean, do you feel possessive about your characters, or?
I don't feel possessive about my characters. In a lot of ways, I think of my work as much more like fan fiction than it is like conventional literature, much more like fan fiction than someone like Jonathan Franzen does. I mean, I'm working in the fantasy tradition, you know, within the fantasy tradition, you're always working with things that came from C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and they were working with things that came from mythology and other folk cultures. So you can't really delude yourself that you're making this stuff up. Maybe you just feel about it a different way than the last person did. So yeah, I think of what I do very much as part of fan fiction, and not really separate from it. There's always been fan fiction. There's always been fan fiction. I mean, when Virgil wrote the Aeneid, he was taking a minor character from Homer and giving him his own story. I mean, what's that if not fan fiction? I think for centuries and centuries, all fiction was fan fiction or fan fiction-like. But it's something special is happening with it right now, I think, just because with the internet, everybody can publish what they do. And you have a general sense of ideas and characters and stories circulating in this cut and pasteable way that they didn't before. So that's going on. And then even on the high side of culture, on the so-called legitimate sort of fancy cultural side, there's no question that we're interested in this stuff in a way that we weren't before, starting in the late 60s with books like Wide Sargasso Sea, which played with characters from Jane Eyre, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which obviously borrows from Hamlet. We culturally somehow got interested in this idea of taking characters from one story and seeing what they did if we put them into a different story. I mean, anecdotally at least, the majority of people who write fan fiction are women. And I don't know why that is. But it seems to be the case. I think there's also a very vocal section of the fan fiction community who are gay, or who represent minorities, who are not often cast in leading roles in kind of the stories that our culture produces. And they, in this wonderful, generative, sometimes angry way, take these stories away from mainstream culture and change them so that they see the kind of people that they are, and the kind of people that they know and hang out with, represented in these stories in a way that they weren't before.
So it's really fulfilling sort of a need to be represented in popular culture.
Yeah. Writing fan fiction becomes a political act of saying, I am disenfranchised. I don't have a voice or a face in this culture, and saying, look, now I do. To the extent that anybody knows about fan fiction in kind of mainstream culture, they know about Slash.
Which
Because
is.
and Slash being stories that pair same-sex couples who aren't paired in the original work. Kirk and Spock being the original Slash pairing, but Slash has since taken care of just about every same-sex combination you can imagine. And people know about Slash because it's shocking and funny and weird, and it is all those things. But it's only a small slice of the full diversity of fan fiction.
So what other, I don't know, so the genres sort of, they run the gamut from...
It's hard to talk about the genres of fan fiction because they're always changing. And one of the main activities of fan fiction seems to be arguing about what the genres are. But you could point to certain things. Some fan fiction stays within canon and within the known facts of a fictional universe. And other fan fiction is AU, alternate universe, and plays with those facts in different ways. But there's so much more. There's the hurt comfort stories, which I love. Someone gets injured or hurt in some way. Somebody else takes care of them. What a primal story that must be for an entire genre of fan fiction to have evolved around it. What else? What are the other main ones? I mean, a lot of fan fiction comes from the shippers, the people who are interested in a particular relationship and want to explore it. Mulder and Scully. We never really get to see them get together in the X-Files. But we sure see them get together in fan fiction. So, you could organize fan fiction, you can divide it up around which relationship it explores. Jacob and Bella in Twilight. There's a whole subculture that's obsessed with that pairing. Harry and Snape. And Harry and Ron, Harry and Hermione. I mean, it almost mathematically every combination that you could imagine gets explored in fan fiction. People are that hungry to know what it would be like. I was really concerned about the response when I started writing about the fan fiction community, just because they've been so misrepresented, in the mainstream media. Talking to people in the community, it was evident they felt like they'd been burned before. and they didn't want another guy staging kind of look at this freaky internet subculture and how crazy it is. They were really looking for somebody to take them seriously. And I think they were on a little bit of a hair trigger. They felt a little defensive, just because they had been so misrepresented and so mocked. And I can relate to that. I think they had plenty of reason to be defensive. But in fact, the response has been great. There's been a lot of, I can show my parents this and they can understand what I'm doing a little bit better. I mean, from outside the community, Slash is all anybody can see, because it is so outrageous. And I guess people want to think of people who write fan fiction in a certain way. They want to think of them as guys, people who are writing about this stuff because they don't have any social lives. Instead of this sort of wonderfully creative kind of generative act that it is, writing fan fiction. It's like just taking out a guitar and whatever, playing some Beatles songs. Except you're not taking out a guitar, you're taking out a keyboard. And instead of the Beatles, you've got J.K. Rowling. It's no different, really. It isn't any different. It's wonderfully punk. It feels the same to me as punk did. It used to be that novels were out there and ordinary people couldn't write novels. It was just untouchable. But the fan fiction people have seized it. They have seized the means of production. And they've staged a revolution. It's marvelous. It reminds me of somebody said about the Velvet Underground that only 5,000 people bought their first album, but every one of them started a band. It's very much the same way. Harry Potter didn't just make readers out of non-readers. He turned readers into writers.
The people taking over the asylum, so to speak.
Sure, it's people feeling like they had no voice. Not feeling like it, they had no voice. The great capitalist media machine was trying to cast people in the role of passive consumers. Who listened but didn't talk back. And I think people got sick of that. They wanted to talk back, and they did, and they do, more and more.
So it's empowering, right? For
very
people
empowering. Yeah. Yes, fan fiction is massively empowering. You've been sat on the couch and told to shut up, and you don't stay on the couch and you don't shut up. You talk back.
Love that.